March 17, 1943, Berlin. Morning light leaks through narrow windows of the Abwehr headquarters. The city outside hums with self-assurance, trams rattling, officers marching, propaganda blaring. Inside, the air is still. Dust drifts between pale beams of sunlight, settling over ledgers, reports, and the faint scent of tobacco. On a desk of polished oak lies a single document. Columns, numbers, nothing else. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris leans over it, his eyes tracing every line. Years of deciphering intelligence have taught him to read meaning in silence, in what's missing, not what's written. The figures before him are not coded, yet their message is more dangerous than any secret cipher. He straightens his uniform absent-mindedly, a gesture of habit rather than pride. To the outside world, he is the head of German intelligence, the man who knows everything. In truth, he has never felt blinder. The numbers tell him something unthinkable, something that will never appear in the official bulletins or the Führer's speeches. America has built a factory so immense it redefines the concept of war itself. Not a fortress or an airfield, a machine that manufactures machines. Willow Run, Michigan. The name appears in a brief note at the bottom of the page, accompanied by an estimate of output that seems absurd. A bomber every hour, 24 in a day, over 700 a month. Canaris blinks, recalculates, then does it again. The totals refuse to change. He knows what they mean. They mean Germany is fighting a nation capable of turning industry into strategy, a country where production lines, not divisions, determine the future. He lowers the paper, resting both hands on the desk. The war has shifted. It's no longer about territory or courage. It's about velocity. Whoever builds faster wins. He stares at the map pinned to the wall. Europe covered in grey pins, each marquee terre, and a conquest. None of them matter now. Every hour that Willow Run operates, the Reich's victories decay a little more. The Abwehr chief moves quietly to the window. Berlin looks unchanged. Clerks hurry across courtyards. Military trucks roll through the streets. Radios carry the same confident voice, promising triumph. He closes his eyes for a moment. That voice belongs to men who believe faith can outbuild steel. He returns to the desk, folds the document, and slips it into a folder marked Urgent, Strategic Industry. He doesn't need to write a commentary. The numbers speak for themselves. They predict defeat more accurately than any spy report, any intercepted cable, any whisper from abroad. Canaris knows he will have to send this upward, through clerks, aides, officers, and eventually to men who prefer illusion to fact. They will dismiss it. They will laugh. They always do. But history will remember this moment. The quiet instant when one man in Berlin understood that the war was no longer being fought on the front lines, but on an assembly line half a world away. He locks the folder, places his pen beside it, and exhales slowly. The hum of the city continues outside, unaware. For everyone else, the war is still being won. For him, it has already ended. If you seek the stories history tried to bury, the moments where destiny shifted in silence, you're in the right place. Subscribe to WW2 Frontales and step with us into the forgotten corners of the Second World War, where every detail mattered and every decision changed the world. Wilhelm Canaris had spent his life serving empires that never understood him. The Kaiser's navy had taught him structure, the Weimar years, restraint. Now, under Hitler, he served a system that despised both. To his subordinates, he was courteous but distant, a commander who valued precision over passion. He rarely raised his voice. He didn't need to. Every man in the Abwehr knew that silence from Canaris carried more weight than most generals' threats. He preferred logic to loyalty, facts to fervor, and that made him dangerous. While the rest of the Reich boasted of destiny, Canaris kept ledgers. He measured the war in resources, not rhetoric: coal, fuel, steel, copper. Every week he compared inputs to losses, and each time the margins narrowed. It wasn't defeatism. It was arithmetic. The numbers spoke the truth that speeches concealed. Germany was burning through its strength faster than it could be replenished. Factories worked at capacity, yet shortages grew. Rail lines strained, labor thinned. And now, with the report on Willow Run, he saw the contrast in its full enormity. America had solved the problem Germany refused to face. They had turned war into routine. In that transformation, Canaris saw a kind of genius, not born of ideology, but of organization. A nation that could teach farmers to rivet wings and mechanics to assemble engines without pause. A people that turned production into instinct. He envied it, even as it sealed his country's fate. His office reflected that same austerity he admired. A single clock, a map of Europe, a row of code books. No portraits, no flags. The air smelled of paper and ink. Each morning began the same way. He would sit, open a folder, and examine the world through numbers. It was his form of prayer, faith in measurement. But faith in measurement had become heresy in Berlin. He had watched the transformation of his peers. Officers who once valued reason now speaking in slogans. Men he once debated with now reciting superstition as if it were science. Even within his own agency, caution had turned to fear. Analysts softened their conclusions before reports went upward. A misplaced phrase could mean suspicion. Suspicion could mean ruin. Canaris did not soften. He wrote with the same precision that defined his life. The truth, he told himself, needed at least one witness, even if that witness would not survive to see it proven. He had never met Hitler personally, though their paths brushed indirectly through the corridors of command. He understood him as a man of instinct, allergic to contradiction. And instinct, Canaris believed, was the most fragile foundation for power. The Admiral knew that Germany's strength had never been in intuition. It had always been in discipline, craft, and calculation. Now, all three were being suffocated by myth. He folded his hands on the desk and thought of the younger officers outside. Men raised on slogans, not strategy. They believed the war could be willed to victory. He knew better. Willow Run had shown him the future in mechanical rhythm. Engines humming, welders moving, metal flowing from one end of the line to the other. Each completed aircraft was another nail driven quietly into the Reich's ambitions. He wasn't angry. He wasn't frightened. He was simply resigned. Wars end long before nations admit they've lost them. He took up his pen and began a note to his deputy. Prepare a summary of foreign industrial capacity. Focus on Allied aircraft output, specifically the Ford plant in Michigan. Mark it confidential. His handwriting was exact, almost elegant. Every letter was a boundary, disciplined, deliberate, final. Outside, a secretary carried telegrams down the hall. Phones rang. A courier wiggled. Lighted with sealed envelopes, life continued in its predictable rhythm. But for Canaris, that morning marked a private reckoning, a realization that reason had outlived its usefulness in the empire he served. He closed the file and placed it carefully in a drawer. For the rest of the day, he spoke little, observing the machinery of a state too proud to see its own disintegration. Somewhere beyond the horizon, 1,000 hands were building the instruments of Germany's surrender, and only one man in Berlin understood it. The first mention came in January. A coded message from Stockholm described an industrial complex west of Detroit. Enormous, beyond comprehension, the agent had written. The phrasing seemed careless, exaggerated, and the report was filed under unverified. Weeks later, another cable arrived, this one from Lisbon. A German shipping agent, traveling under neutral papers, had seen freight manifests listing aviation assemblies bound for a plant in Michigan. The quantities were staggering. Thousands of engines, tons of aluminum, endless crates of rivets. Then came Switzerland, a banker's note intercepted through diplomatic channels, referring casually to Ford's Miracle Factory. By February, the name repeated often enough to lose its mystery. Willow Run. The fragments were small and scattered, but together they formed something solid, the outline of an industrial phenomenon no one had predicted. Canaris summoned his analysts. "Assume it's real," he said quietly. "What would the capacity be?" They hesitated. The Abwehr was used to deception, phantom divisions, inflated production figures, false radio traffic. This sounded like another Allied illusion, a trick designed to intimidate. But Canaris pressed them. "Model it anyway." 3 days later, they returned with their findings. Even under conservative assumptions, the numbers were devastating. If the plant was operating at full scale, the Americans could outbuild Germany's entire aircraft industry within a single year. One of the younger officers stared at the figures, pale and silent. "That would change the war completely," he murmured. Canaris nodded. "It already has." He ordered the files cross-checked against intelligence from neutral ports. Soon, more clues surfaced. A dockworker's diary from Buenos Aires describing endless cargo shipments stamped B-24. A Swedish engineer's letter mentioning a building so large it has its own weather. A photograph from a business journal showing a crowd of women in overalls standing before a massive assembly line. Every detail matched. Every new fragment made denial harder. Still, he waited before sending another report. Verification mattered more than speed. If he was to challenge the Reich's illusion of invincibility, he would do it with precision. Late one evening, his chief analyst entered with a final document, a production estimate leaked from a neutral intermediary in London. It listed output month by month, and the growth curve was vertical. Canaris took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The logic was merciless. If these figures held true, by the end of 1943, the United States would be producing more bombers than Germany had built since the war began. He stood by the window. The streets below glowed faintly under blackout curtains. Trains rumbled in the distance, carrying coal to factories that could no longer keep up. Germany still believed the war was decided by bravery. The Americans had moved beyond that idea entirely. For them, war was now a system, a sequence of tasks, automated, endless. He turned back to his desk, shuffling the pages into order. The pattern was complete. The whispers had become evidence. The evidence, a warning. Somewhere in Michigan, a machine was turning out the future hour by hour. And from Berlin, even a man trained to see through deception could only watch as it began to outpace belief. Canaris marked the file, confirmed intelligence, Allied production, and placed it in the outgoing tray. It was late, and the corridors were empty. As he left, the lights dimmed behind him, one by one. By morning, the reports would reach men who still thought courage could outwork a factory. They would skim the pages, find the tone too cautious, the conclusions too bleak. Then they would dismiss it. But for the man who had pieced it together from 100 quiet fragments, the outcome was already certain. He no longer wondered if Willow Run existed. He wondered how long it would take for its shadow to reach Berlin. The official confirmation arrived on a cold morning in early March. A neutral courier from Stockholm had delivered a coded parcel through diplomatic channels. Inside were photographs, grainy but unmistakable. A colossal structure stretched across an open plain, dwarfed only by the sky. Rail lines cut straight through its walls. Smoke poured from vents in synchronized plumes. Workers, men, women, even teenagers, moved beneath the lattice of steel like parts of the same vast organism. At the bottom of one image, a handwritten label, Ford Motor Company, Willow Run, Michigan. Canaris studied the photographs in silence. No commentary was needed. The scale itself was a language, one his country no longer understood. He traced a finger across the frame, from the entrance where raw metal entered to the distant end where finished aircraft waited in formation. There was no wasted movement, no visible delay. Every motion served the next. The Americans had done something astonishing. They had transformed the principles of mass production into warfare. He read the accompanying figures. 1 bomber completed every hour, 24 in a day, 700 in a month, each capable of carrying 8 tons of explosives over 2,000 miles. He did the arithmetic in his head. In 6 months, the United States could field more aircraft than Germany possessed in its entire arsenal. And that was only one factory. There were others: Seattle, Fort Worth, Long Beach, each expanding faster than their enemy could comprehend. He felt no outrage, only an unnerving clarity. The war had evolved beyond strategy, beyond courage. It was no longer about the brilliance of generals or the resolve of soldiers. It was a contest of tempo, of capacity, of who could turn raw material into destruction with greater speed. Germany had mastered craftsmanship. America had mastered automation. He set the photos aside and reached for a map of Europe. Pins marked airfields, shipyards, fuel depots, all now potential targets for bombers that were being produced faster than his intelligence officers could update the charts. Every hour that the Ford plant operated, the strategic balance shifted further west. He opened a fresh file and began dictating to his aide, his voice low but unwavering. The Allied industrial base has achieved total integration between civilian industry and military output. The Ford plant in Michigan represents the prototype of modern warfare. Production without interruption. Recommend immediate adaptation of our manufacturing system if we are to survive the coming year. His aide hesitated before speaking. Do you think they'll listen, Admiral? Canaris gave a faint smile. No, but we'll send it anyway. The young officer nodded and left with the report. Alone again, Canaris leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling, then at the silent map. A single thought lingered. We are fighting a nation that has mechanized time itself. He wondered if anyone in Berlin truly grasped what that meant. That while German engineers debated design perfection, American workers were producing imperfection in overwhelming numbers, imperfections that still flew, still bombed, still destroyed. The irony wasn't lost on him. Germany's obsession with precision had become its weakness. Every extra hour spent polishing metal was an hour lost to a rival that measured progress in minutes. He turned back to the images of Willow Run. The lights above the factory floor burned endlessly. There was no night shift or day shift, only motion. The rhythm itself was victory. He closed the folder carefully, almost reverently. The world's greatest intelligence agency no longer held the most valuable seat. Cret! That honor belonged to a factory. Somewhere across the Atlantic, another engine was being bolted into place, another aircraft prepared to roll toward the runway. And though no bullet had yet been fired, the outcome of the war had already begun to take shape, in the steady hum of machines that never stopped. Canaris drafted the report by hand. He trusted no typist, no clerk, no carbon copies. Every sentence was measured, trimmed of emotion, built from precision. Facts carried more power when delivered without argument. The opening line was simple. All available intelligence indicates that Allied production, particularly in the United States, has achieved a scale beyond comparison with current German capacity. He listed the evidence like an indictment. Factory output graphs, supply tonnage, manufacturing speed. It wasn't speculation. It was mathematics. When he finished, he read it twice, adjusted a few words for clarity and signed it. The ink dried neatly beneath his name. Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, Abwehr Chief. He sealed it, stamped it, Geheime Reichssache, top secret, and sent it through military channels marked for the Luftwaffe High Command. 3 days later, the report reached Goering's office. The Reichsmarshal was in one of his better moods, lounging in an over-decorated chair, surrounded by aides and the smell of expensive cigars. He opened the folder lazily, scanning the first page without interest. Columns of figures, production tables, logistics summaries. It was the kind of document he had learned to ignore. A smirk crossed his face as he read the heading, American Aircraft Output, Willow Run, Michigan. He laughed. Propaganda, he said. Always the same trick. They think they can frighten us with numbers. He tossed the file onto his desk. The papers fanned out across the polished wood, scattering months of analysis into irrelevance. His aides said nothing. They knew silence was safer than contradiction. One of them gathered the documents quietly, restacked them, and placed them aside. Goering reached for another drink. Factories don't win wars, he muttered. Men do. The laughter that followed was brief but heavy, the kind that fills a room long after it ends. The report was filed under review pending and never reopened. Back at the Abwehr, Canaris waited for acknowledgement. Days passed without reply. When he finally received a memo from the Luftwaffe liaison, it contained a single line. Assessment noted. No further action required. He read it once, folded it carefully, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. There was no anger, only quiet certainty. He had known this would happen. Facts were powerless against arrogance. The Reich did not fear reality. It ignored it. That evening, he met with a trusted deputy in his office. The man had dark circles under his eyes, worn from long hours of analysis. Canaris handed him a copy of the report. Keep this somewhere safe, he said. Not for now, for after. After what, sir? After the illusions are gone. The deputy nodded without question. Both men understood that truth in their world had become contraband. Outside, the night sky was clear. A few bombers crossed high above the city, faint shadows in the starlight, reconnaissance flights, distant, harmless for now. But Canaris knew what would follow. When those planes returned in swarms, no speech or salute would stop them. He thought briefly of Goering. The medals, the bravado, the easy laughter. It was the sound of a man who could not imagine running out of luck. But luck, like fuel, runs dry. Back at his desk, Canaris wrote one last note in the margin of his file. The outcome of this war will not be decided by courage or ideology. It will be decided by capacity. He closed the folder, placed it among others, and turned off the lamp. For a moment, he stood in darkness, listening to the faint ticking of the wall clock. Steady, mechanical, unstoppable. Each second was another lost opportunity, another aircraft assembled, another warning unheeded. By the time the truth reached Berlin, it would arrive not in a report, but in fire from the sky. The second report was longer, sharper, and impossible to misinterpret. Canaris filled it with evidence so thorough that disbelief itself would have to be deliberate. Production curves, shipping manifests, aerial reconnaissance. Each page built a case no rhetoric could erase. He ordered the statistics printed in bold, the charts labeled in clear, unambiguous terms. Every figure pointed to the same truth. Germany was running out of time. The report left his office sealed with his personal insignia and crossed the grey hallways of the Reich bureaucracy, where truth went to die behind marble walls. Days later, it returned. The stamp on the first page was unmistakable. Defeatism, pessimistic assessment, not to be circulated. No explanation, no counter-argument, just the blunt authority of faith refusing to yield to fact. He placed the folder on his desk and stared at it for a long time. The seal of the Reich Eagle stared back. its claws wrapped around the very idea that had just been strangled. Reason. The message was clear. Facts were no longer welcome. Numbers had become enemies. To question victory was to betray it. He leaned back in his chair. The lamp on his desk flickered, casting uneven shadows across the walls. Beyond the window, Berlin moved as if nothing had changed. Columns of soldiers, the chatter of clerks, the same orchestrated confidence pulsing through the streets. But inside the walls of the Abwehr, the air had shifted. Conversations grew cautious. Reports became shorter, vaguer. Analysts who once argued openly now spoke in whispers. Each new truth discovered felt like contraband. Canaris understood what was happening. The Reich was suffocating under its own conviction. The machinery of denial had become more efficient than any weapon. He read the stamped reply again, slower this time. Every word carried the chill of bureaucracy masking fear. It wasn't ignorance that killed reason. It was belief pretending to be strength. He walked to the cabinet where his earlier reports were stored. Each was labelled carefully, numbered, indexed. Dozens of them. Warnings about fuel shortages, rail congestion, labour inefficiency. Now they felt like relics from another era, from a time when logic still held value. He opened one drawer, took out the first Willow Run file, and placed it beside the rejected report. The contrast was striking. One born of evidence, the other buried by decree. For the first time in years, he felt something close to exhaustion. Not the fatigue of work, but of futility. He had built a life believing that intelligence, pure, measured, impartial, could guide power towards sense. But power had decided it no longer needed sense. He poured himself a glass of water and stood by the window. The city stretched beneath him, its lights dim under blackout restrictions. Somewhere below, factories still churned out ammunition, uniforms, and propaganda. Every citizen breathed the same carefully curated illusion that Germany's will could outlast its enemies' machines. He wondered how long that illusion could hold before it collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. Behind him, the office clock ticked steadily. Each sound seemed louder than before, like a countdown only he could hear. He returned to his desk and wrote a short line in his private notebook. The war is no longer about what is true, but about what must be believed. Then he closed it. He didn't send another report that month. He didn't argue. He didn't protest. The wall between knowledge and command had become impenetrable, built not of stone, but of conviction. For a man trained to measure reality, there was nothing left to measure. He turned off the light, leaving the stamped report where it lay. Its red ink glowed faintly in the dimness, like a wound that refused to close. Across the Atlantic, winter melted into movement. The snow outside Detroit had barely settled before the engines at Willow Run thundered back to life. Steam rose from the massive hangars as shift whistles pierced the dawn. Inside, an army without uniforms marched to their stations. Welders, machinists, riveters, inspectors. Ordinary citizens turned manufacturers of history. Rows of cranes swung overhead like metronomes. Sparks cascaded in controlled bursts. The scent of oil and metal filled the air, sharp and constant. Every sound contributed to the same mechanical chorus. Hammers, drills, footsteps, all synchronized to an invisible rhythm. At the center of it stood the assembly line, a mile of steel and motion. From one end, sheets of aluminum arrived by rail. From the other, bombers emerged, complete and ready for flight. The line never stopped, not for storms, not for exhaustion, not even for sleep. The people who worked here came from everywhere. Farmers from Ohio, teachers from Illinois, miners from Pennsylvania. Women filled half the stations, their sleeves rolled high, their hair tied back with scarves. They worked through the night under bright lamps that erased the boundary between day and darkness. Each finished plane carried the mark of their endurance. each rivet the weight of their determination. Henry Ford's engineers had done something the generals of Europe could not. They had made time obedient. Every process was measured, every motion refined. Efficiency had replaced heroism. In the first months of 1943, the plant produced 200 aircraft. By midsummer, it exceeded 500. Before the year closed, the figure climbed past 700. Each machine carried 4 engines, 11 crewmen, and a payload capable of erasing entire industrial districts. The statistics alone were staggering, but what made it extraordinary was the consistency, a tempo that never faltered, a nation that refused to tire. To the Americans, this wasn't war in the traditional sense. It was procedure. Discipline translated into design, patriotism measured in output. Factories like Willow Run, Boeing's Plant 2 in Seattle, and Consolidated's Fort Worth complex became the new front lines, each one feeding the sky with an unending stream of bombers. Every 24 hours, the United States produced more airframes than Germany could repair in a week. The scale defied imagination. Train lines dedicated solely to parts, convoys carrying engines across states, refineries working around the clock. Cities adjusted their clocks to factory schedules. Families marked their days by shift changes. The war effort had become a living organism, enormous, methodical, self-sustaining. No speeches, no triumphal marches, no promises of destiny, only motion. If one engine failed, another took its place. If a worker collapsed, another stepped forward. Failure was irrelevant because the system had removed fragility. At the far end of the line, newly built B-24 Liberators stood in rows, wings gleaming under floodlights. Pilots climbed aboard and took off directly from the plant's airstrip, bound for training bases across the country. Every hour, another rose into the sky, a silver silhouette vanishing into the horizon. Each departure carried the same unspoken message. Production was victory. In Washington, officials called Willow Run the arsenal of democracy. The phrase was poetic, but the truth was more mechanical. It was simply output multiplied until opposition became meaningless. Across the ocean, Canaris would never see this miracle firsthand, but his numbers had already told the story. The pictures he once studied now lived in motion. The whispers had become thunder. And in that relentless hum, the clatter of conveyors, the hiss of air compressors, the steady roar of engines being tested, the future of the war was being decided. Not by speeches or symbols, not by ideology or faith, by repetition, precision, continuity. The factory did not celebrate its progress. It simply continued. Every completed aircraft was both a weapon and a prophecy. Each one closed the gap between belief and surrender. While Europe burned itself in conviction, America built its way to certainty. By the start of 1944, the skies above Germany had changed color. What once was open air had become a ceiling of engines. Dawn arrived not with birdsong, but with the low, distant vibration of bombers crossing the channel. The first formations came in the hundreds. Within weeks, they came in the thousands. Dark shapes moving in perfect geometry, silver wings glinting like an advancing tide. From the ground, they looked endless, layer upon layer, row after row, a moving continent of metal. The air raid sirens grew so familiar that silence itself began to feel unnatural. Civilians counted the seconds between alarms as one counts heartbeats. Cities vanished not through conquest, but through calculation. Industrial centers that once defined the Reich, Kassel, Essen, Hamburg, Cologne, turned to blackened skeletons. Oil refineries became craters. Rail lines warped in the heat, their steel twisted like wire. Entire districts ceased to exist in a single afternoon. When one factory fell, another took its place on the target list. The Allies no longer bombed strategically. They bombed systematically. The rhythm that had begun in Willow Run now pulsed across the sky. Every minute, another aircraft crossed into enemy airspace. Every hour, another wave followed. Each mission was a repetition of the same equation: fuel, distance, payload, return. And every time, the arithmetic worked. Germany fought back with everything it had left: flak towers, night fighters, experimental jets, but the numbers refused to balance. Each bomber shot down was replaced before the debris cooled. Every loss on one side multiplied tenfold on the other. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of the Reich, had become a shadow of its former self. Experienced pilots were gone, replaced by boys barely out of training. They flew obsolete aircraft with dwindling fuel, chasing enemies who could afford to lose. The sky had become a ledger, and the ledger was bleeding red. Canaris watched it all unfold from a distance. Reports crossed his desk faster than he could read them. Strategic bomb tonnage, aircraft losses, civilian casualties, all confirming the same truth he had written a year earlier. The war had entered its mathematical phase. In his office, the sound of explosions echoed faintly from the outskirts of Berlin. The air defense guns fired automatically now, their crews mechanical in routine. Every blast was another denial of reality, another refusal to accept what was already decided. He didn't celebrate being right. There was no vindication in prophecy fulfilled. Each report he opened read like a chapter in a book he had already finished. Synthetic oil capacity reduced by 60%. Rolling stock losses catastrophic. Aircraft replacement below operational threshold. The Reich's lifelines were collapsing, not from lack of courage, but from simple exhaustion. Factories ran without power, railways without coal, armies without transport. Still, official bulletins spoke of perseverance, of secret weapons, of turning tides. But tides don't turn against arithmetic. Every morning, Canaris reviewed the same columns of data and found the same result. The curves all pointed downward: production, morale, fuel, food. Only casualties moved upward. The end was no longer a question of possibility, only of timing. In April, his analysts presented a final projection. By summer, Germany's air defenses would be mathematically incapable of countering the Allied bombardment. He initialed the document without comment. There was nothing left to add. He looked out over Berlin. Grey, cracked and weary. The city was still standing, but the war beneath it had already collapsed. Every building, every street, every siren was now part of the same slow disintegration. The factories of America had written this ending long before the first bomb fell. The rest was just gravity. Canaris closed the report and set it aside. He didn't need to open another. What he had seen a year earlier in a handful of numbers had finally materialized across the continent. The war was ending exact. Liars predicted, not with surrender, not with revolution, but with the quiet mechanical certainty of a problem solved by equation. By the spring of 1944, the walls around Canaris began to close. The Abwehr, once the pride of Germany's intelligence network, had become a liability in the eyes of the regime. Too independent, too questioning, too unwilling to worship falsehood. The Gestapo had been circling for months, collecting whispers, tracing loyalties. To men like Himmler and Bormann, the Abwehr was not an intelligence service. It was a nest of skeptics, a threat to the obedience that held the Reich together. Within the army, Canaris's name no longer inspired respect but suspicion. His calmness was mistaken for cynicism, his reason for betrayal. Reports describing Allied production, fuel shortages, and Germany's faltering supply chain were now labeled defeatist. The more accurate his intelligence became, the more dangerous he grew. In July, after the failed attempt on Hitler's life, the circle finally snapped shut. The conspiracy had many authors, but the regime wanted convenient symbols. Canaris, cautious and guiltless, became one of them. His office was searched, his files confiscated, his staff scattered. The corridors of the Abwehr, once filled with the muted energy of analysis, fell silent. Colleagues avoided his gaze in the hallways. Some offered polite nods they did not mean. Fear had replaced friendship. When the order for his arrest arrived, he didn't protest. He simply stood, adjusted his coat, and told his adjutant, "Keep the reports safe. Someday they'll matter." He was taken first to Flossenburg concentration camp, not as an officer but as a prisoner of the state. His rank stripped, his name reduced to a number. The interrogations began almost immediately. They wanted confessions, connections, proof that he had undermined the Führer's will. But there was little to find. Canaris had lived his life surrounded by secrets, yet had never betrayed one. He spoke softly during quest, eye-owning, refusing anger, offering neither denial nor confession. When his interrogator shouted accusations, he merely replied, "I recorded facts. The facts condemned themselves." Weeks became months. His health weakened, but his demeanor remained composed. He watched guards march in mechanical precision, a mirror of the system that had devoured itself. By early 1945, as Allied forces closed in, the camps filled with the final victims of paranoia. Orders came from above to erase those who knew too much. Canaris was among them. On a grey morning in April, he was led from his cell. The yard was cold, the air metallic with mist. He walked without resistance. A witness later recalled that he seemed neither afraid nor resigned, simply detached, as if observing the final proof of his own calculations. The man who had predicted the defeat of his nation was now the last casualty of its denial. There was no trial, no defense, no ceremony. Only a brief note in a report filed that evening. Admiral Canaris, executed for treason. The irony was absolute. The man who had seen the truth too early had been condemned for seeing it at all. In the months that followed, Berlin burned, and the Reich collapsed beneath the same arithmetic he had tried to warn them about. Factories silenced, railways broken, airfields abandoned. No one mentioned his name in the chaos that followed. It vanished from documents, omitted from speeches, erased from the narrative of martyrdom the regime crafted for itself. But his absence spoke louder than any accusation. History would later recover fragments, reports bearing his signature, notes written in calm, narrow script, and the precise warnings ignored by those who demanded blind faith. In those remnants, the story of Wilhelm Canaris survived, a man loyal not to leaders, but to truth, destroyed by the very blindness he had tried to cure. He had spent his life serving a machine that could not tolerate honesty. In the end, it consumed him exactly as he had foreseen, methodically, without pause, without reason. By the time the guns fell silent, the truth was already written. The war that had promised 1,000 years of triumph ended in 6 of collapse. And when the rubble settled, when flags were torn down and silence returned to the cities, the verdict emerged, not from speeches, but from numbers. Willow Run had produced 8,185 bombers. Factories across the United States together had built more than 300,000 aircraft. Germany, even at its peak, had managed less than half that number. The war that began with ideology ended with arithmetic. Reports compiled by the Allied Control Council told the full story in columns and charts. Every page an obituary for illusion. Production ratios, fuel consumption rates, tonnage of steel, all showing what Canaris had seen 2 years earlier in that quiet Berlin office. Where the Reich had chosen faith, others had chosen efficiency. Where it built monuments, others built machines. And machines, once set in motion, cannot be reasoned with. Willow Run was silent now, its hangars emptied, the assembly lines quiet. But its echo remained, stretching across oceans and ruins alike. The rhythm that had once forged wings from metal had changed the course of civilization. Across the Atlantic, German factories stood gutted, roofs collapsed, furnaces cold, cranes rusting over shattered concrete. What had taken years to build was undone in months by the very bombers that Willow Run had produced by the hour. No ideology, no speech, no army could contest that simple truth. Output was destiny. The Allies had not just outfought Germany. They had outproduced it, outlasted it, outmeasured it. For every division Germany raised, the Allies manufactured 5. For every tank destroyed, 10 more replaced it. For every day of defiance, another 1,000 tons of explosives fell from the sky. It wasn't bravery that decided the war. It was tempo, a rhythm that began on factory floors, carried by men and women who would never see the front, but who shaped its every outcome. In post-war Germany, survivors tried to explain the defeat. Some blamed leadership, others fate. Few dared to acknowledge the simplest truth. They had been conquered not by genius, but by repetition. Willow Run stood as proof of that principle, of what could be achieved when organization became an instinct, when ambition was measured not in slogans, but in production schedules. For Canaris, there was no monument, no recognition. His name remained buried in archives, his reports gathering dust in locked drawers. But history had vindicated him in the only language he ever trusted: data. Every destroyed airfield, every burned refinery, every surrendered garrison confirmed his prediction. The war had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the factories, months before the soldiers realized it. In the end, the empire that believed faith could replace logic was dismantled by the one that believed logic could replace faith. A simple equation had decided the fate of millions. Production multiplied, resistance divided. The result was inevitable. 8,685 bombers, each one a verdict. And behind that number, the echo of a single morning in Berlin, when a quiet man stared at a sheet of paper and saw the future laid bare. March 17th, 1943. The day Wilhelm Canaris understood that destiny had already changed hands. The war ended as it began, with a calculation. History isn't just memory, it's warning. If stories like this one help you see the past more clearly, share your thoughts below. And if you'd like to keep exploring the hidden moments that shaped our world, subscribe to WW2 Frontales. More untold stories await, each one revealing how the war was fought and how humanity endured.